Chapter 36. Far different circumstances. The city of Paladar was on high alert the day Talgarth was expected to arrive. There was no more speculation, war was a fact now. The streets were busy, with people running to and fro to finish preparations and lock themselves away inside their homes. Fathers carried swords with their wives and children, hauling bags and carts of spare food and other supplies behind them. Caleb trotted his steed through the chaos to the front of the city, and watched the soldiers on the street hurry the crowds forward with warnings to stay inside and be ready for the worst. Caleb turned in the saddle of his war mount and gazed back at the castle. He had seen Layla just once more before he left, earlier over a hasty breakfast with the others. Afterward she had wished that fate be with them, and had given each of them, even Elastra, an embrace. He wished he could have held her through the battle, beyond the chaos, and long after. This parting was not a mere departure to an Avondale scuffle at the borders. This was charging the front lines against a formidable enemy. He could still see her hollow eyes as he had reminded her that the ring meant he would always be there to protect her, as if she was already beyond his protection. He wondered if his reassurances were sufficient, when the soldiers in his company suddenly arrived and coaxed him to leave more hastily than he preferred. No matter. By this time tomorrow this will all be over. For better or worse. A cluster of mounted soldiers met him at the gates of the city, among whom was Leothran. Beside her horse stood Anselm and Elastra, whose conversation broke short as he rode up to them. Anselm was wearing his robes as always, but had a fitted breastplate over his chest and spiked greaves on his ankles. He could see that below the chest plate he was still wearing his satchel, and it hung out of his armor on his hips over the handle of a dueling sword he was probably forced to take. Though his sword skills were sufficient, he never fancied them, and it looked a little out of place. Elastra beside him had her hair tied up out of the way, and she too had a few necessary pieces of armor about her with a sword, and was missing her usual array of jewelry and ornaments. Caleb thought something more looked different about the two of them, and he spotted it after a moment. They were each wearing brand new boots, not a common article for anyone in their group. Leothran looked much the same, wearing the clothing she had traveled the distance from Tritus in, a bodice vest over a light shirt and tall boots. From her elbows down, however, she was now wearing metal gloves, and along with the two swords at her side she also carried a longbow and shield on her back, and several daggers strapped to both legs. From what he had seen already, Caleb agreed that armor would only be a nuisance for her lightning-quick footwork and strikes. He himself had taken up the armor he could, while retaining the flexibility he would need for both ground and mounted combat. He wore his preferred style of headgear, a heavy helmet with no visor like the horned one he kept back in Tritus. His chest, arms and legs were well protected, although he neglected wearing any chainmail as he disliked the extra weight. He wore his one-handed dueling sword on his hip, and on his back he carried his heavy broadsword with a shield. "You made it through the mob," Anselm said. He looked more rested than normal, and Caleb smiled to see his friends with him on the edge of battle. He nodded and dismounted. "Are we ready? Have we heard any news from the front?" "I have been out here much of the day. Sir Olam sent me to wait for you. All of the last scouts have returned, and we expect the enemy to be visible from the city in less than 2 hours. Just before the end of the 4th quarter of the day." Caleb mused. "That will give us little time before daylight fails. Hopefully we can deal the most damage before then." "That is what Olam hopes as well," Leothran explained. "Come, Caleb. He is waiting." Anselm walked to Caleb's side and clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't die out there, my friend," he said. "If your father indeed discovers more conflict brewing in Talgarth, you may have another long road ahead of you after all of this. You be careful too, Ansel. Let's hope we can hold them on the other side of the bridge." Anselm nodded. They had been through many battles together, and the fire of anticipation building inside was all too familiar to Caleb. They smiled and exchanged a firm handshake with an understanding that they had always shared, that this possibly could be their last meeting. Leothran pulled Anselm aside and began relaying something Olam had said from atop her horse, and Elastra took his place by Caleb's side. "Here we are again, my friend," Caleb said. "On the brink of another plunge into battle. It's our lot in life, I suppose, she replied. Though this time we are not side by side. You'll have to take extra care out there. If you get yourself hurt, I'll find you and finish you myself. She spoke with a smile, but Caleb could hear the sadness hidden behind her jape. Her eyes were confident and caring as they looked into his. You take care, Alastra Flitchett. And watch out for Ansel. I always do. You and Leothran as well, she said as they moved to his horse's side. If the battle goes ill, it will bring me courage to know the sage of Tritus waits for them atop the wall, Caleb said. Alastra slowly embraced him. Not the sage, but Alastra will be waiting, she said. Waiting to see you safe, Caleb. She stepped back and motioned him back on his horse. Leothran was waiting patiently. Caleb climbed up into his saddle and nodded down to her. Thank you, Ella. Thank you for everything. He kicked his horse to move by Leothran, signaling for her to lead the way. Her horse reared up on two legs in excitement, and she tapped her forehead twice. May fate keep you in his hands. See you on the other side, Caleb heard Anselm call as they rode away toward the gate. He turned back to look at them again, but a passing troop of soldiers veiled them. As the doors on the city wall opened and he and Leothran rode through, Caleb saw the wide hazy expanse of the Phaldician fields for the first time since they entered the city, completely transformed for war. The area just outside the gates was filled entirely with tents. Most were used for housing troops from surrounding cities who had come to fight, but there were also others set up to provide shelter over blacksmiths hard at work sharpening weapons and making adjustments to armor, and servants laboring over large cauldrons in the middle of roaring fires. They seemed frantic in their efforts to finish their work, to have time to clear the area and secure the city entrance. Caleb followed Leothran through the narrow lanes between the tents and watched the men below turn to stare at her. Many were confused to see such a woman amongst them and so heavily armed, while some of the bolder men smiled and whistled after her, but they may as well have done nothing. From what Caleb could tell, she heard none of it. They reached the great bridge that crossed the river and passed the towers at each end as they made their way across it. Archers stood on guard at the top, and a group of men were working together to haul a bundle of harpoons up the ladder. The whole bridge was a sea of orderly chaos. Animals hauled weaponry back and forth, armored men ready for battle marched to their posts under shouts from their officers, and over the side of the bridge wall, final tweaks were being made to the barricades set up on the banks of the river. At last they passed by the towers at the front of the bridge, and continued on to the fields where the bulk of the men were assembled. Metal glittered in the sunlight on a mass of thousands of men scattered over a wide area before him, and he felt right at home. Another battle. The infantry were all furthest out, while many of the cavalry were closer to the bridge feeding their animals and running mock charges. Pikemen and archers were scattered throughout. Leothran led Caleb off to the side of the field a ways, and found Olam in a tent looking over a table with wooden figures placed all across its face. He looked up and smiled as they approached and turned from his table. His hair was tied in a secure knot on his head, and his thick neck was buried in the tops of a chainmail shirt under his heavy armor. With his helmet on, there would almost be nothing of his person visible. In contrast to his rough exterior, his eyes still held their customary gentleness. He went to help Leothran from her horse, but she was on the ground with reins in hand before he could take 2 steps. "Ah, Captain Caleb. I see you have found him," he said, turning to Leothran. "Thank you. Are the 2 of you ready? The enemy has received much strength throughout their march, it seems. They should be upon us soon." "How many?" Caleb asked. "We think they may have grown by at least 2,000, Olam said as he leaned on the table and inspected the map again. "But most of them are ghouls from the mountains and lakeside regions. Untrained and inadequately armed." "Ghouls are weak and stupid creatures," Caleb said. "But in numbers, they should not be underestimated. They had similar troops when they attacked Tritus." "Indeed," Olam nodded. "Look here." He showed them the map and the wooden figures. 3 tall ones represented the predetermined lines of defense, the field, the bridge and the area before the walls, color-coded with defense ranks. Caleb noticed that if the enemy were to somehow get across the river, there would be ways around the castle wall to other possible entrances, although these routes would be small and very difficult for large numbers to access. Captain Caleb and Lady Leothran, my second and chief generals, are assisting with some final preparations at the bridge, Olam said. Would you two accompany me to the negotiations when they arrive? It would be an honor, Olam, Caleb said. He looked to Leothran. Her yellowish eye narrowed in thought. They will likely know me, she said. I was once their captive for a long time. But I will ride with you as well. The outcome will not change. Olam smiled and laid a hand on each of their shoulders. Suddenly horns blew in the distance toward the field, triggering loud bells from somewhere on the city wall. The men are falling into rank, he said, taking up his helmet. He ordered the other men standing in the tent with him to take the table away and begin clearing the fields. The enemy approaches. They have entered the region of Paladar. Come. We must be off to the front. By the time they found their places at the forefront of the fields, most of the men behind them had organized and were standing in formation, the infantry divided into groups of 1,000 with lines 3 deep of archers at the front of each of them. The cavalry assembled further back and far off to the side, ready to charge in at the planned time during the second wave. All was quiet for nearly another hour, before at long last a dark line appeared on the horizon. Over the following half an hour all of them watched the armies of Talgarth move closer, ever so slowly. As they drew near, more details were visible. The high flags of the Crimson Sun flapping on the chill evening breeze, the mounted men at the front, and the wild antics of bloodthirsty ghouls as they waved their weapons overhead, making them look like a sea of black churning water. The twisted image of men and ghouls uniting to fight brought a scowl to Caleb's face. It is time to pay the debt of Tritus and Grimhall. Now I will avenge the death of King Rawlin. This time I am ready for you. Before Caleb realized it, the forces of Talgarth had halted 400 paces off, and 3 lone horses rode ahead toward them. The mass of their army was enormous, easily outnumbering their own by perhaps several thousand, but Caleb was hopeful. Numbers mattered little when ghouls were going up against armed and well-trained men in thick armor. Olam looked at the falling sun and smiled. They could not have chosen a better time to arrive, he said. Before Caleb could ask what he meant, Olam signaled for him and Leothran to follow, along with 2 standard-bearers. Caleb kicked his horse into a gallop, and they raced to the empty space between their forces where the Talgathians were waiting. The man leading the Talgathians rode at the head, with a confident look imprinted on his face. The man whom Layla had seen in her dreams, and whom he had spied upon from above in the Flagstaff Manor. He had long hair and a sharp nose, almost elegant, Caleb thought, and not much older than himself, perhaps nearing 40. Caleb's stomach turned when he saw the creature riding next to him. It was not a ghoul. Too big and thick, but it was most definitely not a man. He had large teeth jutting out from his bottom lip, and his eyes were big and yellow like that of a ghoul. He also had their characteristic large pointed ears. A half-breed. Just as Leothran had said on the road from Tritus. He shuddered at the thought. Behind them were other men carrying high banners. The Talgathian man at the head spoke first. I am Palson Materel II, General of Talgarth, and leader of this company. We are under orders from the Queen herself to raise this city, and if you do not surrender it up, we will have no choice but to unleash hell upon you. We have conquered first in Avondale, have passed through Manon and now into Faldesia, where we will see the same victory. General Palson's words were convincing, but there was something about the way he spoke that seemed odd to Caleb, as if his words were thin and shallow, scripted and rehearsed. It was not fear, but something told him Palson did not want to be there. He chuckled inside at his claim that victory was had in Avondale. But he held his peace to let Olam do his duty. We fear nothing of you, Olam said. Nor of your mass of rabble. Not even 10,000 of your gathered ghoul dogs could dream to breach our defenses. Not even abominations like the one I see before me, he said, looking straight into the half-ghoul's face. He got a snarl in return. I will offer you but one chance for survival, he continued. Turn your army around, and we will allow your men to pass unhindered through our lands back to the shores of Manon. From there you can flee back to the east. If you deny our offer, then you will know the might and valor of Faldesia when you draw your last breaths, and see your dead strewn in ruin across the rocks." The half-Gruul opened his angry, frothing mouth to speak, but Palson stopped him with a raised hand. "Well said, Commander." "But you underestimate us," Palson retorted. "We have gifts from the Queen, more than just men and Gruuls, and I promise you, this will be a day of blood if you do not surrender now. Nothing can stop the march of Talgarth." "You err," Olam said. "We have heard of your Shadow Walker allies. They will not save you. You claim you had victory in Avondale, but I have two here who fought in the Battle of Tritus, and they know the truth. Not even your treacherous stealth attacks could take them down, and only an empty treaty of peace holds Manon back from slaughtering you from behind. You have had no victory in your campaign. And if you do not see the madness your queen has led you into, then you are blinded indeed, and fate be with you." The half-Gruul was fuming by now, but Palson seemed to be considering his words carefully. Caleb surprisingly sensed that this man was not just a mindless slave for Queen Tamara, but a real man fighting for something, and he had a feeling it was not for the glory of Talgarth. Palson looked at him and then at Leothran and froze. As Leothran matched his gaze, Palson gaped and his eyes grew large with surprise. "You," he hissed. "It has been some time, General Palson Marterel II," Leothran said mockingly. "We last met under far different circumstances." Palson sat speechless for a moment, but suddenly threw his head back and laughed. "So Faldesia houses Shadow Walkers as well," he said, his amusement filled with anger. Olam looked at Leothran. It was now he who wore a look of disbelief. Palson chuckled again. "It would appear you have some secrets of your own," he said to Leothran before speaking to Olam again. "Allow me to do you a favor, my lord, and tell you with whom you ride. She is not from Tritus or even the Westerlands. She is a murderer from the east. She and all of her people, going about burning villages and slaughtering innocents. Always plotting in the dark with deceit and lies, as has been proven here. Well, for your sake, I hope there are no more Shadow Walkers hidden in your company that choose to stab you in the back when it will benefit them most." Caleb looked at Olam, not knowing how he would react to the news. Leothran was not fazed in the least, and her gaze still pierced straight ahead. "The people of my home are no such things," she retorted, trying to redeem herself before Olam. "Though some follow such ideals, I do not. Was it not Talgarth that captured and enslaved me and my people, and used them as tools for their dark designs?" "Are we finished with this?" the half-Gruul rumbled. His voice sounded like churning vomit. Palson clenched his teeth. "We are finished, Mayor Zuck. And you, Shadow Walker," he said to Leothran. "Your hour has come. I will find you on the field, and you will answer for the sins of your people." With that he turned and raced off back toward his army, with Mayor Zuck behind him and the standard-bearers at the rear. Caleb kicked his horse closer to Olam. He was looking at the ground. "Olam, what Leothran has said is true. She is a Sartir but not a murderer. A Shadow Walker here, and in the castle all along," he muttered to himself. "I did not intend to be deceiving," Leothran said. "I only kept it from you, because of the hostility your people have against mine. My loyalty has not changed, and I will die today with you, or live to see Paladar survive." "We are truly sorry," Caleb said. "Olam, you must believe us." Olam looked out at the enemy forces, then again at the sinking sun. Caleb wondered what he would do if Olam were to turn against her now, but his smile soon returned. "You have shown nothing but peace and honor here, and if it were not for you, we could not have been ready for them." He looked up at her and Caleb. "I trust you. My lady, Leothran. Sartir. Friend. Forgive me of my thoughtlessness. Now come. We have a war to wage." Leothran and Caleb smiled emphatically, and Olam looked westward one last time where the sinking sun was dropping quickly. "It is time."
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.